The day the lions came back to the city, ash lay on the rooftops like a dandruff of old fires, and the air carried that faint bitter tang that lingered after pitch had burned. Jaime Lannister watched dust drift down a shaft of sun inside the throne room, a lazy slow fall that made him think of snow in the northern tales Lannisters never told their children, for winter and want were a poor man's fables. The dust settled on the steps below the Iron Throne, and on those black steps King Aerys sat hunched, his spine as bent as a scythe and his hair a nest of iron filings. He rubbed his hands together and whispered nothings to his nails, as if they were traitors in need of confession. "You see them?" he asked, and did not look at Jaime. "You see them? They bring fire in their wagons, you know. I smell it. I know that smell. Sweet. Sweet as a green apple." Jaime kept his face as it should be, bright and empty with the thin sheen of courtesy that had always pleased the ladies of the court and infuriated his father. "The Lannister host flies the royal standard today, your grace. Their lions bite both sides of their mouth," the king said and laughed, and then stopped as if he had surprised himself with the sound. "Both sides. They bite both sides, Kingsguard, and I will bite back." His finger trembled as he pointed at the doors. "Go stand by them. I don't want them to come in all at once. I won't have them spilling and spilling like grain. My floors are clean." Jaime took his place by the doors and thought of Cersei, who would be watching from some balcony, golden as a promise, the way heat rose from her when she wanted something. He wondered if she wanted the same thing their father wanted. The city secured, the rebels broken, the king quieted like a sick horse. Only Cersei liked crowns and their weight. She liked the imprint they left on the skull. Varys drifted into the hall, the silk of his slippers whispering. The master of Whisperer's face had the smoothness of a polished egg, as if it had been rubbed and rubbed until no trace of the farmyard remained. He gave Jaime a glance that meant nothing. He bent his head to the king and spoke as if he were soothing a child. "Your Grace, the lions ask leave to enter in peace," he said. "Lord Tywin swears that his swords have never been sharper for you." "Sharper," Aerys crooned, and pinched his lower lip. "Yes, yes, sharper to cut the traitors. The traitors in the city. The traitors in my bedchamber. In the kitchens. In the bells. They have crept into the bells." He pressed his fingers against his temples and closed his eyes. "Pycelle says to let Lord Tywin in. Pycelle would let winter in to test if it was cold. Your Grace appointed Wisdom Rossart to watch the gates with the captain of the watch," Varys said softly. "No one enters without your leave. Rossart." The king's mouth curled as if he sucked a bitter seed. "He smells of green apples too, but he is mine. Mine. Bring me my leal Lord Tywin." He tilted his head back abruptly and stared with ferret-bright intensity at the bare iron behind Jaime. "If he has brought his wagons of fire, I want to see them. I want to see them. The city will learn who belongs to fire." The hinges groaned when the doors opened, and the sound ran up the ribs of the hall like a traveler ascending steps two at a time. Tywin Lannister came in without hurry, as if he had walked across his own courtyard and not the court of a king who had once kept him from his sleep with insults and daylight jibes. Kevan was at his shoulder, a smaller copy with softer edges. Behind them, Lannister officers moved with the measured grace of men who had learned to bow while wearing steel. Tywin's cloak dragged in a curve of crimson cloth that pooled like spilt wine at his heel when he knelt. He bent so precisely that Jaime felt his throat tighten for no reason he cared to examine. His father's head lowered, and in that abasement there was a blade. "Your Grace," Tywin said in a voice without ornament, "we have come at last." Aerys leaned forward on the throne as if the iron had bitten him. "You took your time, Lord Tywin. Perhaps you paused to sharpen your fangs." "We paused to count your enemies," Tywin said. "We ran out of hours." Jaime watched Varys' mouth flicker. The eunuch was counting as well, counting murmurs, counting the tilt of heads on long necks in the galleries, the lift and fall of chests that tried not to show relief. Tywin's eyes did not climb to Jaime's, though once they had held his son like a nail holds a board, pinning him to a future with no edges. "Stand, Lord Tywin," Aerys said. "Here are the ruins of my court. Guard them, or burn them. The alchemists have been busy. I have been busy. We are all busy bees. Tywin rose. My men will relieve the watch at the gates. I ask leave to send word that the Lannister host has come to the king's side. The Reach holds Storm's End under my brother Mace. The red wine fleet sits the waters. With your leave, your grace, none shall pass in or out of the city save by your will. Aerys rubbed his nose, then peered through his fingers. You will shut both doors? Both? You have always liked doors, Lord Tywin. They open when you smile. They open when you command, Tywin said, and the words were the least true he had ever spoken. I ask leave to take charge of the city's defense. Wisdom Rossart came up from the side like a stain spreading. The pyromancer's robes glimmered with a dull sheen, and Jaime imagined he could smell that apple sour tang now, though it might only have been memory. Your grace set me to the gates, Rossart said, and attempted a bow designed to place his head between Tywin's and the king's. And I am set to the walls, Tywin said smoothly. The walls are higher than the gates. There is room for more than one man to work. Aerys looked from one to the other, and Jaime saw the quick scuttle of mistrust travel across the king's face and hide under his beard. You may work, he said petulantly, but no one moves a single jar of my fire without my leave. No one, Tywin agreed, and with that consent claimed everything else. Later, when the lions had spread themselves through the city like warm coals under ash, Kevan followed his brother into the Tower of the Hand, a place which had been both a home and then a room barred to Lannister feet. The corridor smelled of old paper and the wax of many candles. The servants who had abandoned this tower as if it were a lamed dog came back by twos and threes, faces cadged from the alleys, eyes quick with hunger. You put me over the watch, Kevan said, still a little dazed by it. The captain will not like it. The captain is a truncheon that changed hands so often it smells of both, Tywin said. Bring him to my solar and he will like whatever he is told. You have men you trust. I brought 600 who would follow me into a well with the rope cut, Kevan said. Adam is in the city. He will bring in more by night. Janos Slint, Tywin asked without looking up from the map he had spread over the table. He is a butcher's son who eats from every hand, Kevan said after a pause. Shall I clap him in irons? Clap him in gold, Tywin said. It takes fewer hands and makes less noise. His finger moved across the parchment. The mud gate is the softest hinge. Slint the butcher will have the mud gate. He will be loyal to whomever keeps his bellies full. He tapped the other gates in turn. We will leave the iron gate to the old guard. They are loyal to the coin they are paid on time. The river gate goes to Adam. The king's gate will be ours. The lion gate I will keep for myself. And the alchemists? Kevan asked with only a slight curl of his lip. Varys will show me where they have put the jars, Tywin said. We will put them where they should be. You intend to. I intend not to lose the city to a brand and a whisper, Tywin said. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. Rhaegar is dead. His rubies lie in a river. Aerys is alive and mad. The realm is neither. The realm wants to live. It is for men like us to teach it how. The rebels will come down the king's road with the taste of the ford still in their mouths. They will expect a door opened or a door ajar. They will find a door with lions behind it. Kevan's eyes dropped to the map. The city unfolded in neat ink streets and squares, a maze every child in Flea Bottom knew better than most lords knew their own halls. You will not, we will not. Tywin's mouth made the shape of a smile and then discarded it. We will not do what I came to do once. No, this time there will be no children broken on walls and no women sobbing blood. We came to take the city from our enemies, and our enemies are outside the walls. Kevan nodded. He did not ask which enemies Tywin meant. Some questions were only asked once in a man's life. When Jaime came to the White Sword Tower to change his cloak, Cersei was already in the small round room, looking out at the city through a slit like a patient hunter. Jaime shut the door behind him and stood in the tight circle of her perfume. So, she said and turned a little. He has come to heal. "He has come to rule," Jaime said. Cersei's smile bared her teeth. "He always does. Will the king let him?" "The king has no choice," Jaime said, and then remembered that in their lives, choices had always been illusions. Masks removed after the dance was over, revealing the face they had been forced to wear from the start. "He has appointed Rossart to sniff the jars. He still speaks of burning. Father will take away the tinder and leave him to blow on wet wood." "Rossart," Cersei murmured. "He is a worm that thinks itself a dragon. I have spoken to Pycelle. He winces when I approach, like a dog who expects a beating and hopes for a bone." She touched Jaime's sleeve. "You told me once that if Father were named Hand again, you would throw down your white cloak at his feet and come home." Jaime looked at his own hands. They were clean. "I was younger." "You are still younger than your oath," she said. "You were when you took it." He did not answer, and after a little while she moved to the door. At the threshold she turned. "Viserys is 12, she said, "and soft as cheese. If Father is wise, he will set a new crown on that boy's head and put me beside him. The city will love a golden queen more than a mad king. Even mad men tire. They tire, Jaime." "Father is wise," Jaime said. He did not look at her hand on the door ring. "He will do what makes sense." "Sense," Cersei said. "Yes, it is a pretty word when a man needs to lie to himself." The rebels crept down the king's road like a storm with blue edges. Eddard Stark rode with ice in his bones and mud on his boots. He did not tell anyone that he had dreamed of the trident every night since it had taken the prince from them, and all the rubies had leapt from his breast like a school of fish. In his dreams he reached, and the water closed over his wrist, cold as a truth, and then he woke with his hand clenched and empty. Jon Arryn rode at his side, old and rigid and carrying the calm of the mountain with him. "Your father and brother died in this city," Jon said once as they rested their horses. "So did honor. We must walk carefully upon the bones." "Honor is not a path," Ned said, though he had once thought it was. "It is a weight. We carry it or we do not." Hoster Tully sent men to the van and men to the rear and kept the river at his left as if it were his wife. He spoke of winter stores and of the price of barley with the same solemnity he spoke of bannermen. His daughter Catelyn had left his tent 3 nights earlier with red eyes and dry cheeks. Ned had touched her hand and said nothing because he was newly a husband and had not yet learned what words to spill and what words to damn. When they came within sight of the city's walls, the sun was no more than an oyster pearl above them. The mudflats of the river threw back a dull light. Ned saw strange new patterns on the walls. Patches of scaffolding like broken ladders, men crouching behind mantlets, and one more thing he had not expected. The gates were closed and would not be coaxed. "They mean to fight," Jon Arryn said softly. "They mean to hold," Ned said. He tasted iron as if he had bitten his own lip. A rider came out from the postern by the river gate under a white flag that had never seen a washtub. He wore crimson with a lion's head worked into the leather. He gave his name as Adam Marbrand, and his hair was fire quenched with oil. "My Lord Hand bids you parley at noon by the King's Gate," he said. "There will be security and witness. The King's peace is not in question." "The King's peace," Hoster Tully said with a scowl. "Who's king?" Adam did not answer, only sat his horse as if it were an easy chair, the reins in his hand as if they were a napkin. Ned did not like him because he was good at his work and looked as if he was pleased by it. "We will be there," Ned said. By noon the heat had painted the stones with sweat. The city's gate tower rose above them like a blunt finger pointing to an indifferent god. Tywin Lannister came down the stairs with 3 men beside him. Varys was one, Kevan another, and the third a man with a scar that had cut into the shape of his mouth and given it a permanent sneer. The sneering man watched the crowd, not the lords, and the way his eyes moved told Ned that he would run if he had to and kill if he had to and otherwise find a cup and a woman. The city bred such men in litters. "My lords," Tywin said, and inclined his head as if he were allowing them into his hall out of bad weather. "When I left the city some years ago, I expected to return on an afternoon such as this. "You left because a king made it too small for your pride," Jon Arryn said. "I left because a king forgot his friends," Tywin said. "It seems he has remembered them again. For I am here and the city has opened its doors to me." "The doors look closed," Hoster said. "They are closed to flames and wolves," Tywin said, and let a hint of warmth creep into his eyes. "You have come far, my lords. Lay down your arms and take your pardon. The realm needs sowers, not harvesters." "Rhaegar is dead," Jon Arryn said. "Just so," Tywin said. "His son is not." The line continues. "The king sits in his hall, and the prince in his nursery. The queen is at Dragonstone, the king's brothers-in-law in Sunspear, the reach tight about Storm's End. There is a house to be repaired. That is the work of men, not boys with hammers who love the sound they make." Ned felt his jaw set. He was not a man who loved the sound of hammers. He had never been one for sound at all. "The king you serve burned my father and brother," he said. Tywin's face did not change. "I serve the realm," he said. "I serve its peace and its purse and its memory and its reputation. Aerys is ill. The crown is not. Do you wish to throw it in the river because the man who wears it is unfit for the weight? Thrones are made to outlast men, Lord Stark. Let us show ourselves fit to outlast our hates." Jon Arryn lifted a hand. "If the Mad King is ill, let him be eased, set aside. Let the boy be guarded and guided. That is what you mean to do, if we lay down arms." Tywin's gaze slipped to Varys and back. "The queen's son is an infant. The king is his father," he said, which was the same thing and not the same thing at all. "If you lay down arms, my men will not open the gates to turn you into carrion under your own banners. If you do not, you will bleed at the walls while the reach comes up behind you and the sea shuts against you. We will set out tables on the walls and eat bread in your sight, so that you know how empty your bellies are." Hoster Tully's hands gripped his reins. "You speak like a man who means to be hand again," he said. "I speak like a man who remembers how," Tywin said, and let the words land where they would. "Will you have peace?" Ned saw faces in the press beyond the gate looking down through the grates. One face was small and dark and loose-tressed, a girl with dirt on her mouth. She was laughing. Nearby, a boy with broken sandals stared as if his heart sat just beneath his eyes. The city's life went on above and below words like these, a long pulse through generations of brick and straw. He thought of his father hanging in his armor while King's fire climbed his legs fast as ivy. He thought of Brandon with a leather cord in his mouth and a twisting dance that choked off speech and went on without words. He thought of a promise he had not yet made at a bed he had not yet seen. "Open the gates," Ned said in his head. "Open them and let us end this." But his tongue said, "We will take counsel." The words were sour. They tasted of whetstone. Tywin inclined his head as if the answer had surprised and pleased him. "Do not be long," he said. "Time is a sword that only ever cuts one way." When the parley ended, Varys shadowed Tywin back up into the tower and at last into the quiet of stone. He placed a hand on the map where Tywin's finger had rested, delicately, as if he could warm the parchment with the heat of his palm. "They will not yield today," Varys said. "They will not yield tomorrow," Tywin agreed. "Until they are shown that tomorrow is meatless and colder than today." "The king," Varys said, and let the word drift like a feather from a balcony. "He speaks of fire behind every door. He commanded Rossart to move 300 jars into the vaults under the Great September. He commanded the captain of the watch to burn the hay carts in Flea Bottom if the gold cloaks fall back. He has given his leave to 𝒂𝒏𝒊𝒔𝒒𝒂𝒓𝒅 to open the old vaults beneath the Guildhall. He has named the fire my true guard." Tywin listened without moving. The sunlight made a square on the table. He set his hand within it as if measuring his patience. "How many jars are truly in the city?" he asked at last. Varys' smile was a careful fold. "More than there were and fewer than he thinks. The alchemists rejoice when kings find fear sweet. Their ledgers have swelled like harvest bellies in these last months. But this city has 1,000 cracks and I creep through most of them. Some jars are not where they should be. You moved them. I do not have hands, Varys said mildly. There are boys who dote on coins, and men who fear their wives' questions when the house smells of sweet rot. The jars are heavy for one man and not so heavy for three. Some have been moved to places where they can be supervised. He glanced up. You intend to learn every room by heart. I intend that Rossart be unable to do more than talk about fire, Tywin said. The king will not be put off forever, Varys said softly. Kings are men, even when they are monsters, Tywin said. Monsters still sleep. Give him women to blunt his teeth. Give him words. Speak to him of his victories. He has none, so invent them. Tell him the Reach has sent him 1,000 bushels of praise. Tell him the gods have weighed his enemies and found them wanting. And what of the prince? Varys asked. The little one with milk on his mouth. Aegon is the only victory the Targaryens have left, Tywin said. And for a moment there was a warmth that might have been pity and might have been calculation. He is the future. He will not be harmed. And the girl? Varys asked. Tywin's eyes flicked. We are not sacking a city, he said. No, Varys said. Not this year. That night, under overbright stars that seemed insensitive and asleep, Kevan Lannister met by lamplight with the officers of the City Watch. The room was 𝒂𝒏𝒏𝒊𝒅𝒅 and smelled of oil and sweat. The captain had a mug on the table but did not drink from it, as if he had not yet decided if he liked the taste of this new loyalty. Kevan spoke plainly of wages paid on the 1st of the month and the 15th, of bonuses for men who did not sell their posts, of pension coins for those who lost a hand or an eye, of cheap bread storehouses, of privileges over alehouse brawls. He did not speak of honor or crowns. The men's eyes followed the numbers like cats follow a moth. You will choose 4 senior men, Kevan said. You will keep them in quarters near their gates and feed them well. You will not let them go home to wives and cousins while they learn what price your post will fetch. We'll need more men, one said cautiously. We are thin at the mud gate. You will be thicker by noon, Kevan said. Adam Marbrand will send you 60 with crossbows and eyes that stay open through rain. We will ease the city into sleep, and then we will teach it how to wake. Cersei sat with Pycelle in the dim of the maester's chambers while a summer fly named itself on the window for an hour. She had dressed simply for a queen without a crown. Silver thread at the wrists and a jeweled pin that could catch on a man's thoughts. Pycelle sweated and spoke at length of herbs that could slow the blood and herbs that could quicken it. Of old kings with trembling hands who had been steadied with poppy and old queens who had miscarried twice and borne sons the 3rd time after chewing bitter roots on holy days. You are telling me that men are mixtures, Cersei said at last, almost yawning. I know that. My father is a mixture of stone and echo. The king is a mixture of smoke and wasp sting. Pycelle arranged his hands atop his belly as if he were hiding a small bird there. You must not think me disloyal, my lady, he said. I served your lord father when he was the king's hand. I admire him and always have. He is firmness where other men are water. The realm needs such men. But the king is the king, Cersei said, and let her voice drape itself over the word as a lover might drape her hair over a bare chest. Tell me what herb makes a man sleep. Milk of the poppy, Pycelle said at once, grateful to be in familiar country. But it dulls the wits. Taken often, it unmans men. There are gentler draughts. Enough for a night, perhaps 2. Bring the gentlest, Cersei murmured. The king has been much vexed. If he sleeps, he will wake Kinder. Pycelle blinked. The master of whisperers. Varys will pat his head and tell him a story, Cersei said with soft contempt. My father will set stones in order, and you will brew a cup when I ask it. The realm will be grateful to you. Gratitude is like wine, Pycelle. 1 cup and you want 2. When the moon thinned to a nail paring, the wind fouled and came up from the water with the stink of salt and old nets. The rebels set their camps along the riverbanks and on the hills north and west like so many snoring beasts, fires blinking red as eyes across the land. Tywin stood on the wall walk above the king's gate with his cloak wrapped close, not for cold but for clean edges. Adam Marbrand came up beside him, his breath visible. his hair tied back against the wind. "Their foragers keep near," Adam said. "They fear to come into the city's stink. They will learn to love it," Tywin said. "Men love any place that does not kill them today." "Shall we harry them?" Adam asked. "We can open by night and close by dawn. Take 200 out each dusk. They will not sleep well for 3 nights. Not until the watch changes twice in our sight, and no gate captain sells us twice with the same smile," Tywin said. "Not until the gold cloaks look at us and see paymasters, not usurpers. And then we will let them sleep a little less and care a little more," Tywin said. "And when they begin to look to their right and left for rescue, we will have something to show them on both sides." The something grew on the water like a rumor. From the guild hall of the alchemists came carts at night, each wheel greased and each hammer wrapped in rags so that no sound betrayed them. Men carried pots on slings as if they bore their own children, and gilded chains of apprentice pyromancers shuffled, muttering prayers to gods that smelled of sweet sour rot. Under Tywin's eyes, the jars went to places that were not the vaults of septs and not beneath the streets of markets. They went instead to barges and shallow-bottomed skiffs planked with green-painted wood and lined with wet horsehide. They went to piers where river water lapped and flaked the old slime from stone. They went beneath the arches and into the shadows, and when the sun came the jars could not be seen at all. Wisdom Rossart came upon Tywin by the 3rd night and bobbed a bow. "Your Grace," he said to the wrong man.
I wondered."
"You wondered what the hand of the king does at a riverbank," Tywin said. Rossart's smile was an accident. "We are ready, Lord Tywin. Every cellar in the city watches over wisdom. Every archive is a treasury. Every temple is a furnace waiting for your light. And if the king's enemies never come through your temple doors?" Tywin asked, and regarded the small man with cool interest. "If they come down the river in rafts and boats while your fires sit in flocks under icons of gods who do not care to burn?" Rossart's mouth opened and closed, then settled into a hopeful line. "There are jars for that too, my lord. We have long considered." "You have long considered many things," Tywin said. "Now you will do one thing that I will consider." He turned his head slightly and Adam came out of shadow and stood behind Rossart without sound. "Lead this man back to his brethren. Tell them that any alchemist who moves a jar without my leave will find himself sitting naked atop one of his own devices. We will see if the gods love their servants when they are lit." Rossart's bow was nearer to a fall as he retreated. While the city coiled itself for the strike it meant to deliver, the sea beat Dragonstone with its long hands. In the castle of black stone that drank light and made shadows hungry, Queen Riella labored in a room that had once opened onto a terrace where dragons had taken the air. There were no dragons now. There were midwives with frightened eyes and old men with gray hands, and the storm. The storm had been blowing for a day and a night and then another day, tearing the royal ships from their anchors and tossing them against one another until it would split and men cried out and no one heard them. Viserys crept into the corner of the chamber and held himself small. He had been born in the Red Keep and brought to this place like a cat shoved into a sack. He sat with his knees to his chest and watched his mother's face and felt each contraction as if the stone itself had clenched. "I am a prince," he told himself aloud, and the wind took the words and threw them against the shutters like pebbles. "Open," his mother said. "Open. Let the air in." No one opened anything. The wind would have come into the room like a madness and blown out the candles and the small life between Riella's legs. She cried out, and when she did the full-bellied thunder overhead answered her. "Another," the old maester said. "Another push, my queen. I beg you. You must." "I must," Riella whispered, and thought of her first son, of his dark eyes and long hands, and of the women who had loved him who were not her. She thought of her second son in his corner, clutching his chest as if it had a door he could hold shut. She thought of the husband who had once been golden and had fallen to ash. She pushed, and the storm pushed back, and then there was a cry that was small but sure. Someone laughed and then sobbed and then laughed again and said, "A girl!" Viserys stood as if he had not been crouching at all. "A sister," he said. "A daughter." Rhiella whispered, and took the small purpled body to her breast and forced her heart to be quiet. They will call her Stormborn, she said, and thought of the city she had left and the king who could not and the boy who would and of the men who would decide if any of her children would live to be more than names. In the morning when the rebels tried the river, the Blackwater ran quick under a thin wash of rain, and the barges that Tywin had hidden were hidden still. Ned crossed himself with his eyes. 400 men in boats, a great many more waiting to leap aboard. They had chosen the shallows near the rushes where the water fanned. The fellows at the oars were rough men, river folk with stumps for teeth and wrists like knots. The Lannister archers showed on the walls as slim silhouettes. The rebels raised their shields and the first arrows thudded into oak and back, and above it all came the sound that Ned had learned to fear most. A cheer that had no joy in it, only hunger. Then the river flowered. Green fire opened in smooth, round blossoms between the first ranks of boats where the water was deepest and slickest. There was a moment in which no one understood, and the flames themselves seemed to hesitate, confused by having been let out into air like birds freed from cages. Then the rain laughed and became steam, and men did the same, and all the greedy sound of a river's life turned to the sharp, crackling voice of something that hated life. Boats struck and twisted and rolled their crews, and men clawed at burning wood as if they loved it. The fire clung to them and wore them like coats. It burned in the rain. Ned shouted until his throat hurt, and no one heard that either. He dragged 3 men up by their collars and shoved 2 more with his boot and waved his sword at the boats still waiting and did not know if anyone watched his blade or the flames. Jon Arryn slammed a horn to his mouth and sounded a retreat, and the sound was like a cold hand in an oven. The river folk pulled at their oars until their knuckles went white. When the rebels reached the bank, some of them kissed the mud, which is another god no man names aloud. From the wall, Tywin watched the green churning like an alchemist's dream and permitted himself the narrowest exhale. Adam stood beside him with a face that had learned caution. "Shall we order a sortie?" Adam asked. "Take them now while they cough." "Not yet," Tywin said. "Let them cough. Let them listen." He raised a hand and a runner went down the stairs and out the postern and across the space between city and camp under a little square of white. The man reached the rebel line still breathing. He gave Jon Arryn a letter with Tywin's seal and turned and came back. And no one cut him down because this was not that day. Jon Arryn broke the seal and read. He had the oddest urge to laugh. "Bread," he said. "The hand of the king offers to send bread. He says the city has grain. He says he is concerned that our men must be hungry after the morning's work." He handed the letter to Ned, and Ned held it in fingers that trembled with spent fury. The words were neat and bare. "We will not starve," Hoster Tully said, white around the mouth. "Not today. Not today," Ned said. The bread carts came that afternoon all the same, rolling down the causeway and over the open space with slow certainty, the white cloths tied to their rails fluttering. A line of gold cloaks walked beside them. The bread was loaves of coarse brown with the smell that draws flies and men with equal ceremony. The men who took it from the carts were those too slow to arrive at the river that morning, and those who had learned to take whatever was offered when it was offered. Jon Arryn watched with a face that was not ashamed, for men ate and did not die of fire while they did. "They will say he is merciful," Hoster muttered. "He is a butcher making us fat." "Men remember who feeds them," Jon said. "So do dogs. We will tighten our belts tonight, and torching his wagons will not make ours fuller. Let them eat, and then we will wait." While the rebels waited, Tywin moved quietly into the spaces that had been left for him. The alchemists went back to their cellars with faces of men who had discovered that their god listened after all. Rossart said little and smiled less. Varys smoothed panic with stories of how the flames had been modest, a demonstration only, a mere handful of jars to show the rebels that the city had teeth, not a plan to drown the whole river in green damnation. Oh dear no. The city slept and woke and slept again and learned to live with the presence of Lannister boots and the absence of any sudden screams in the night. That last learning made all the difference. Aerys took his draughts. Cersei gave him cups with her hands and stood to watch him drink. She did not curtsy when she left the room, a slight that Pycelle pretended not to notice and Varys wrote down in his book of debts and overpayments. The king dreamed and woke speaking of burning, and then forgot his dreams and spoke instead of how his white cloak had glowed like a throne when he was young. Jaime stood outside the door while the king slept and told himself the old stories. A boy can choose his road. A boy can turn around. A boy can lie down and sleep and wake as a man. He had never been very good at lying to himself, but he was proud of how long he tried. News came like birds, in flocks and with droppings. Barristan Selmy had been found half dead on the field, with the weight of his name barely keeping him from sinking under. Robert Baratheon had ordered him brought into a tent. The rebel lord had leaned over the old knight and said something no one could quite agree upon afterward. Some had said, "We are not dogs," and some had said, "You fight to the last in the wrong cause and I will drink to that." And at least one had said, "Get up, old man, I might need to kill you again." The truth of the words mattered less than the act. Robert had sent Barristan back under a flag of truce into the city on a litter, thin and pale and nearly smiling. Aerys screamed when he heard that Barristan had not died, and then refused to see him. Tywin received him in the Tower of the Hand, with Kevan standing like a pillar and Varys like a curtain and Jaime in the doorway like a statue that had somehow learned to breathe. "My lord," Barristan said, and tried to kneel and failed and looked embarrassed. "I am yours as always." Tywin's mouth tightened by the smallest fraction. "You are the king's," he said. Barristan bowed his head. "Of course. You will take 50 men and ride to the dragon pit," Tywin said. "You will hold it with your life, Ser Barristan. You will see that nothing and no one enters or leaves without my leave. You will command as if you were hand in that place. You will make the dragons their sleep quietly." "I am no jailer," Barristan said softly. "You are a sword that does not cut the hand that holds it even when it should," Tywin said. "The city needs such swords. Go." When Barristan had gone, Jaime said, "You set him to guard a ruin." "I set him to guard a hill," Tywin said. "There are tunnels under that ruin. There are places in that hill that lead into this fortress. If Varys knows them all, then I know most, and if I know most, I will see that a man stands at each place where a rat can become a wolf." Varys smiled. "I would never call myself a rat, my lord." "I would," Tywin said without glancing at him. "I call myself a lion, and I call wolves wolves and men men. You may call yourself whatever pleases you. See that you answer to it." The thing that moved first after the river was not a matter of steel but of whispers. Tywin's letter reached Old Town by a circuitous route, passing from hand to hand as if it might burn anyone who held it too long. It was addressed to Lord Leighton Hightower and to his daughter the Wise, and it said little. That the city was secure, that the boy Aegon was living and laughing, that the queen had borne a daughter in the storm, that the realm could still be stitched together if men would thread their needles with wisdom. In that white tower where bells sounded the hours like the murmurs of sea gods, Leighton nodded and sent a raven to Lord Mace Tyrell at Storm's End. Mace read the letter aloud to his bannermen and made a speech of comparative pomposity about duty and precedence and the necessity of good lunches to maintain morale during sieges. Paxter Redwine smiled and went on drinking. Randall Tarley tightened his mouth and counted the arrows and the length of rope. At Storm's End, Stannis Baratheon did not hear the speech and did not care to. He sat in the hard chair that had belonged to his father and then his brother and scowled at hunger. The walls of Storm's End were old and thick and had learned to resist time. Hunger had not. When Davos Seaworth came through the side gate with a boat full of onions and fish and a grin that would not be shamed, Stannis nearly wept, which is a thing men like Stannis do not do except when the gods are unkind enough to make them human. "I smuggled for kings and beggars," Davos said, dining on praise he did not ask for. "I thought it time to smuggle for honor." "For honor," Stannis said with such odd gratitude that Davos blinked. "You have saved us all." "Not all," Celis said from the shadows. "We have mothers with shriveled breasts. There are children who think a cup of water is feasting. They will have bread before winter," Stannis said. "They will have meat before spring." "The king offers bread today," Celis said. "Have you heard, my lord? He sends bread to the traitors' camp as a sign of mercy." Bread is bread, Davos said, and was silent when Stannis' eyes cut toward him. When the bread carts returned into the city at dusk, a man's hand, dirty and strong, reached up and pressed a scrap of cloth into the undercarriage. In another cart, a woman in a tattered shawl smiled and took 2 loaves and pressed a piece of dyed yarn into the cuff of a gold cloak sleeve. The cart drivers did not notice. No one did, not even the spymaster's boys whose eyes were bright as minnows. Varys noticed in the morning when 3 of those cart drivers were found with their throats tightly cut and their purses still full and their handprints black with ink. He knelt by one, touched the cloth with 2 fingers, and carried the scent with him when he went to Tywin. "Dornish," he said, and held the cloth to Tywin's nose. Tywin smelled oranges long past their season. "They have crept into the bells," he murmured without heat. "They whisper that Lord Tywin intends to keep the prince and lose the king," Varys said mildly. "They whisper that a Dornish spear will find a child's bed." "The city is not sacked," Tywin said. "Find the whispers' tongues and cut their whispers away." Varys bowed. "I will arrange for them to speak less. But you should know what music is being hummed." He paused. "There are those who say that the prince is not in the city at all." Tywin's head turned slowly. "What do you say?" "I say that men like to tell tales at night," Varys said. "Stories are blankets we pull over ourselves. They make us feel less alone." He opened his hands. "I know where the prince sleeps. I know what he eats. I know which nursemaid sings him which song. I can tell you the pattern of his cough." "You take too much pleasure in those words," Tywin said. "You take too little pleasure in any words," Varys said sweetly. "That is why the ones you speak are believed." On the 10th day after the river burned, Robert Baratheon came up the Kingswood Road with 200 men. They were not his best 200. Those he had broken at the ford and left there, but they were 200 who would dance behind him when he swung that hammer he loved more than his crown. He had been told by 36 men that it was madness and by 2 who had fought beside him that it was necessary. Robert did not differentiate well between those 2 things. They came around the low hill where the King's Road twisted, and Robert spurred for the gap between a thinning stand of alder and the ditch the city had dug to the east. The Lannister scouts were there, of course. There were always Lannister scouts when a man hoped they would not be. Adam Marbrand closed like the lid of a chest, and the 2 small forces met where old apples lay rotting and the insects rose in clouds at every hoof strike. Robert's laughter hit the air like a thrown mug. He broke a man's chest with a single swing and then turned and broke another. His horse took an arrow and screamed and fled under him, and he leapt to the ground and waded through men as if they were barley he meant to thresh. Adam met him with a long sword and a shark smile and lasted longer than most. The hammer took him on the shoulder and sent him to one knee, and then men came around him and dragged him back, cursing, before the second blow could smash him into silence. Robert fell. Not properly. He did not lie down. He went to one knee and shook his head like a dog and swore, and then a club wrapped in iron rings struck him from behind, and he saw a brief piece of blank white and then nothing. When he woke, his hands were tied and his head throbbed, and the hammer lay 6 feet away like a disinterested friend. He blinked until the world decided to return. Adam Marbrand sat in the grass nearby, pale and smiling crookedly with his injured shoulder bound up like a silly present. "You're a heavy man," Adam said cheerfully. "I will feel that in my bones until winter." "You're a dead man if you don't cut these bonds," Robert said, and then grinned himself because he appreciated a man who smiled while he bled. "That was luck." "If it were luck, my lord," Adam said, "I would not be smiling. It was practice." His smile straightened. "You will be treated with the courtesy owed to a great lord." "Because you fear my men," Robert said. "Because we fear your brother," Adam said. "He is less courteous than you." They brought Robert into the city under a hood, not to hide his face but to cool him with damp cloths so that the swelling on the back of his head might not go to fever. Tywin received him in a room with no windows and a table long enough for 30 merchants to curse their wives. He had wine poured, not spiced and not hot, and waited until Robert's eyes could look at the cup without flinching. "You have me," Robert said when he could speak without wincing. I have no coin on me. You will need to send to Storm's End for your ransom." Tywin did not smile, which always seemed to disappoint men meeting him for the first time. "I want no coin from you, Lord Robert," he said. "I want an end." "Kill me then," Robert said easily. Tywin regarded him. "I do not kill men who might be useful," he said. "You are a hammer who thinks every problem is a nail. Some problems are knots. Hammers make knots too tight to untie." "Then cut them," Robert said, and threw back the wine. Fig the knots." "Your brother holds Storm's End," Tywin said. "The Reach is content to hold him there until the end of the year, and then another if it must. I can free him tomorrow." Robert's eyes came alive at that, in the way of a man who does not love war for war's sake, but for the men he can feed when the war is done. "How?" "By asking Mace Tyrell to march," Tywin said. "He will be delighted. It will be his triumph. He will tell the story of it to the end of his life over too much wine. He will think he has done something. He may even have done it, but he will have done it because I told him to. And when your brother walks out under a flag, he will kneel to King Aerys and to Prince Aegon. Then he will go home. You will go home too." "Storm's End is mine," Robert said flatly. "I am no oathman to the Mad King." "You were," Tywin said. "Words do not melt because a man bellows at them. Your brother will hold his castle. You will keep yours and feast until you are gray. You will have sons who swing hammers at boars and laugh too loudly at supper. You will die fat and happy and old. There is worse punishment." Robert barked a laugh that surprised even him. "What if I prefer to die young and loud?" "Then you will die," Tywin said. "I prefer to keep you. There are other uses for you, Lord Robert. A realm is a net of marriages. We will have need of a strong Stormlord who likes his cups more than his counsels." Robert stared at him. "You are going to make me swear." "I am going to offer you a choice," Tywin said. "You can take the black. You can walk north and swing your hammer at things that grunt in the night. You can be hailed as a hero by men who have frost in their beards and no daughters you would care to look at. Or you can bend your knee and go home. Your brother will not bend without you. He is a knot. You can be the knife that cuts him or the hammer that crushes him. Choose." Robert did not answer. He drank again and found that the wine did not offend him. Jon Arryn met his foster son under a white banner outside the city a day later and looked into eyes he had watched grow, and saw there the uncertain thing he had always feared. Not cowardice, never that, but a practical emptiness that comes to a man who has been offered an easy road after a hard one. Robert did not kneel. He stood and said, "They want me to take the black." Jon Arryn said, "Do it, live. They will free my brother if I bend the knee," Robert said. "He will not bend without me. He will starve first." "He will not starve," Jon Arryn said softly, "and he will not bend either. He is a Baratheon in that way that makes a man into stone. And you know as well as I that once you bend, you do not unbend." Robert laughed that laughter which had always made Jon Arryn think of broken jugs and spilled ale. "I have always been supple," he said. "I bend on waking. I bend at supper. I bend when some girl smiles at me over her cup." "You bend because it pleases you," Jon Arryn said. "This does not please you." "No," Robert said. He looked toward the city and then far beyond it, toward a tower in a land of red stone and wind where a promise waited like a knife under a pillow. "But it saves my brother." Jon Arryn did not tell him not to do it. He put his hand on Robert's shoulder and felt the great boy's muscle there and wished he were a priest who could forgive sins before they were committed and call them merits afterward. Robert went into the city at dusk and knelt on cold stone before a king who had been wakened for the occasion and whose eyes were glazed with a gentleman's sleep. Aerys' hand trembled and fell on Robert's hair and lingered there as if it were uncertain whether to bless or smother. "Rise," the king whispered. "You are spared. See how merciful I am." His mouth twitched. "See how my fire is green and your blood is red. Green eats red." Robert looked up and smiled with an insolence that had charmed 1,000 wenches and enraged 100 lords. He said nothing. Jaime stood by the throne with his hand on his sword and watched the man he had once imagined killing with that sword choose a path that was neither noble nor unclean, only human. He felt something uncoil in him and then coil again, slower this time. The next morning, the Reach marched away from Storm's End under banners that flapped with exuberance. Stannis watched them go with a face that betrayed nothing. He did not kneel to anyone. The ravens carried the king's pardon and Stannis' silence north and east and west. In the camps along the river, men woke to find that the sound of marching feet had moved from behind them to far away. Jon Arryn called a council in a tent that smelled of deep leather and stale plans. "We cannot take the city with what we have," he said quietly. "Not now. Not with the river against us and the sea against us and the Reach no longer at our back. The North has men to bring yet. The Vale can empty once more if it must. But we cannot stay here and bleed. We will fall back to the Trident and send word." "There is word I must fetch," Ned said at once, and the way he said it made them all look at him. "There is a place I must go." "Go," Jon Arryn said, "and the quicker the better." He knew what place it was and what word would be born or die there, and if he had been a younger man his heart would have tried to run ahead of him. "Take only those you must." Ned rode with 6, and Howland Reed rode among them and was the only man besides Ned who knew what they sought. The red mountains of Dorne rose out of the land like a memory of teeth. The wind there carried dust and the smell of pepper bushes. They found the tower in the noon glare, its stones white as an old bone. There were 3 white cloaks at the door and no expressions on the faces above them. Arthur Dayne with a sword like pale dawn. Oswell went with the blank look of a man who had forgotten how to be surprised. And Gerald Hightower with a mouth that had said too many prayers and had no more words and did not know what else it could do but hold itself shut. "We have come to take her," Ned said. His voice was dry and flat. He had thought there would be some poetry to this. There was none. "I beg you, do not make us shed blood here. The king commanded us to guard the prince and the lady," Gerald Hightower said, "and left the titles where they would sting. We have not left our post. The king commands many things and commands nothing," Ned said. He did not reach for his sword. He only looked from one face to the next as if the answer might be written there. "When Rhaegar fell, the world changed. You cannot stand in a river and tell the water to go back where it was." Arthur Dayne's eyes were sad, which made him more frightening. "We swore," he said, and the word lay in the sun as heavy as iron. He drew dawn, and it made no sound as it left its sheath. The light ran along it as if it had always been looking for a home. "We swore and we did what we should. Do what you must, Lord Stark." They fought in a small, hot place that did not care about them. The mountain wind watched and did not pause, even when steel bit stone and men breathed hard and then breathed no more. Ned saw Howland Reed go down and then up again like a fish in brown water. He saw the pale sword flash, and he blocked it with a skill that surprised him because he had been taught by cold men on a cold yard with a cold wooden blade and had never thought himself graceful. He fell, he rose, he moved, and when it ended there were 3 white cloaks on the ground and one still standing above them with his sword pointed at the earth as if it were a thing to be pitied. "I did not want this," Ned said to the dead. He said it to the living as well. He went into the tower and found the bed and the sweat-wet sheets and the scent of blood and milk and saw his sister, who had always outrun him, lying as if she had run too far and was only resting a moment before she would leap up and laugh and sprint ahead. She took his hand and placed it on a small bundle, and the bundle made a sound small enough to fit inside Ned's chest. "You must," she whispered. "You must promise." "I promise," he said. He did not ask what, for the shape of the promise had already formed itself out of the air. He took the child as if it were a sword he had been entrusted to keep for a friend who had not come back from a battle. He left his sister with flowers he did not know the names of and went back down into the day and felt the sun lay its weight on the baby and on his mouth. He rode north with the child and the silence of men who had seen white cloaks folded like broken snow. In the camp on the Trident, Jon Arryn met him with eyes that had seen the inside of too many decisions. Ned did not hand the child to anyone. He held it until he could find arms that were his to burden. The fighting did not vanish because Robert knelt. There were still men in the Riverlands who had lost fathers and would not forgive the word pardon. There were still bold riders who thought they could slip between patrols with a town in their pockets and pull it out like a coin when they reached home. There were skirmishes and fire in stubble fields, and men who hung from trees because they loved to take road widows, and Tywin hanged them because he loved order, which is a colder thing. But the fever had broken. When the Reach came up at last to feed the city with oxen and flour carted behind a gaudy procession, Tywin stood at the gate with Lord Mace and embraced him before the people as if they had not spent a season bartering curses in letters that would never be read aloud. In the Red Keep, where the bricks held heat like grudges, Elia Martell walked again under the colonnade where she had once stood with her son on her hip and watched the garden through a drift of leaves while men shouted far away. She had not been dragged screaming down a hall, and she had not died while a soldier laughed. She still breathed. When she saw Tywin, she stopped. He stopped also and bowed as a man bows to a queen once, and then to a widow, and then to a living dagger. "Princess," he said. "My lord," she answered, and the words cracked in her mouth like dry twigs. "My children sleep without dreaming of boots," she said, and the unspoken pressed against her lips like a bruise. "I am told I am safe." "You are," Tywin said. She looked at him a long time. "I thought my safety would look different," she said at last. "Safety usually does," Tywin said. "It is rarely beautiful." She laughed then, and her laugh was like a glass falling and shattering and then being swept up. "Doran writes to me. He asks for your head in one letter and your hand in another. He is a cautious man. He believes in writing practice." "The prince is prudent," Tywin said, and did not say that he had counted on that prudence the way a sailor counts on a north wind. Cersei came to her father with the same deliberate step she used when she came to a mirror. "You have done this," she said. "I have done what the realm could not teach itself to do," Tywin said. "If men were born knowing how to choose their kings, I would have no work." "Set me by the boy," Cersei said. "Make me queen of a kingdom you control." Tywin did not answer at once. "Viserys is 12, Cersei said. "Viserys is at Dragonstone," Tywin said. "He is the king's son. He is the queen's son. He is the brother of a dead prince. Men will look at him and see a name they recognize. The boy Aegon is the name they will come to recognize if we keep him alive. Marry yourself into that recognition. Make it grow. You will stand beside Viserys because it will tie the rock to the crown and because it will set a leash in your hand. You will be gentle with it. You will not pull too hard until the dog learns to come when it is called." Cersei's eyes flashed at the word dog. She half smiled, which was the same as baring her teeth. "He is a boy who plays at kings with little stones and knocks them over and laughs. I will teach him to laugh at the right moments." "You will be patient," Tywin said. "If you speak before you should, men will call you your father's daughter, and they will mean it as an insult. If you speak when you should, they will call you queen. I prefer that." "And Jaime?" she asked. "Jaime will keep his oath," Tywin said. "A white cloak binds better than any chain." Cersei stared at him as if he had slapped her. "You bound him to that chain," she whispered. "I bound you both to your uses," Tywin said. "That is what fathers do who intend their children to outlast them. Jaime will be my voice beside the king when the king's own voice wanders. You will be my hand beside a boy who will play at kings and grow bored with the game. I will be the realm's hand whether I wear the pin or not." Varys found Tywin that evening counting a list of men whose names made no music. "You are more cheerful today," the spider observed. Tywin did not look up from his list. "The rebels are gone from our walls. I have watched the king sleep 3 nights without startling himself awake with his own words. The alchemists complain that their god is neglected. The Reach once again fancies itself important for having delivered sheep and cabbages. And in Dorne," Varys said, "they whisper that you spared the little prince to spite them. They whisper that you spared his mother to tempt them. They whisper that you mean to wed your daughter to the boy, and when she bears him a son, that son will look like a Lannister and sit the throne with golden beard and cold green eyes." "And what do you whisper?" Tywin asked. "I whisper that men see what they want to fear," Varys said. "Whisper louder," Tywin said, and signed the bottom of the list in a hand that did not waver. "Whisper that I do not intend to die while fools hold knives." When the wedding was announced, the city pretended to be glad. Cersei looked like summer. Viserys looked like a boy sent to bed without supper and told to be happy about it. Aerys sat in a chair on the dais and talked to a ribbon on his sleeve. The Prince Aegon banged his cup and laughed. Princess Elia watched from behind her fan while Doran Martell's letter, gracious on the surface, sharpened underneath, lay folded in her sleeve. Jaime stood behind the king with a face like carved milk, which is to say flawless and dead. Tywin looked at the hall and saw that the mortar had set. Ned Stark reached the neck with his child silent at his chest, and the wind coming flat across the water like a hand smoothing a bed. He did not tell anyone whose child it was. He named it with a name that had been a joke between him and his sister and then not a joke between him and anyone. He told Catelyn a lie that took the shape of an apology and placed the child in her arms with a look that was heavier than any oath. Catelyn looked at the child and looked at Ned and began to learn the slow lesson a good woman learns when she marries a man who cannot tell her everything and will never betray her and will always, in that not betraying, wound her. "It is a boy," she said, as if she had discovered a secret. Ned said. "A boy." He lay awake that night and listened to the frogs on the water and the creak of a plank and the long sigh the reeds gave when the wind shouldered through them. He thought of the king in his chair talking to ribbons and of the woman who would sit beside a boy with a paper crown and teach him to harden his face. He thought of a man in the city with a pen who could kill as surely as a sword if he wrote down the wrong name in the wrong place. He thought of the promise wrapped in cloth under his roof. "You will be safe," he said to the dark. "I will make you safe." In King's Landing the days took on the shape of the men who lived them. Tywin rose early and met with his brother and with Varys and with whatever men had business that day that could not be put off until a quiet morning. He wrote letters and read letters and burned letters. He dismissed those who could not be taught to be useful and elevated those who could. He walked the walls and counted sacks of grain and made sure that the Goldcloak's boots did not rot. He had men he trusted pick over the alchemist's ledgers with care and instructed Rossart that he would die for the crime of arithmetic at the first hint of a misplaced jar. He spoke to the king as briefly as possible. He did not flatter him and did not radict him. He set him in a chair with a tapestry behind him and paraded ambassadors across the room and let them see that the throne was occupied and the realm not in flames. He ordered that the king's nails be trimmed once a month no matter how he raved. The first time, Aerys had screamed until he fainted. The second time he had screamed less. By the third time he had looked down at his hands with a puzzled, almost boyish expression and said, "I used to have handsome hands." Jaime learned the king's sounds and silences and stood in the right place for both. He discovered that he could make the king quiet sometimes with nothing but his own stillness. He found that if he did not speak at all, others spoke too much. He listened. He learned the timbre of Varys' lie-telling and the twinge in Pycelle's voice when he turned coward. He learned how and when Cersei spoke truth and when she dressed it in chandelier glass to make a better show. He began to see his father more often than he had expected, and when he did, Tywin would sometimes pause as if he had lost his place in a list and look at Jaime's face, nod at the white cloak, and nod as if a report had come back from a far border where his own blood went riding. Cersei softened Viserys with the same attention a cat gives to a mouse that it intends to leave alive. She had him laughed at and she had him praised. She had him clothed in fabrics that made him think himself a prince and then took the garments away. She read to him from histories in which boy kings had ruled wisely and from tragedies in which boy kings had been used and then butchered. She learned how to make him ask her opinion and then she did not give it so that he would come back tomorrow, and she learned how to give it in a way that made him certain the thought had been his. She gave the boy the experience of power in careful sips to keep him from drunkenness, and when he gulped, she took the cup away for a day and fed him fruit instead. In time, he came to her on his own. In time, he thought he loved her. The Prince Aegon grew and grew. He babbled in 2 languages because his nurse was Dornish and his tutor was from the hills. His sister's hair placed itself on her head like white fire. Rhiella sent letters written in her own hand as her strength allowed, and when her strength began to fail, she sent a lock of the baby girl's hair tied with a thread, which Cersei smelled once and then placed in a box that she told no one about. She would open it and look and then close it and remind herself that sentiment is a string you pull to open your own throat. The realm returned to itself in the way a man returns to his habits after a fast. Merchants began once more to call the city their whore and show her their purses. The river carried upstream not soldiers but lumber and sacks of barley. Men remembered that roads were for walking and not for dying beside. They told stories of the night the river burned and how the fire had refused to drown. They told stories too of a hammer that had fallen twice in one life and had not been lifted again. They talked about Jon Arryn and how he had gone back to the Vale with something broken in his mouth and something repaired in his eyes. They talked about the North and how the winter there did not care who was king. In Old Town a bell rang and Lord Leighton Hightower climbed his tower and read a letter twice and said to his daughter, "This is how dynasties are mended, with gold thread and ugly stitches." In Sunspear, Prince Doran turned the letter that his sister had written him in his hands and held it to his heart because he was a man who loved long and suffered it. Oberyn laughed and then did not laugh and then sharpened a spear that did not need sharpening and spoke too loudly in a courtyard so that the walls could carry the echo and the servants could be certain to repeat it. In the rock, quiet as a tomb full of unspent coin, ravens came and went with the regularity of a banker's breathing. Lord Tywin sat in his chair and held one letter longer than the others. It was from a man in the north whose hand wrote slowly and carefully as if each word had weight. The letter thanked the hand for bread sent by way of White Harbor and for justice done by a road in the Riverlands where 3 men had been hanged for taking a farmer's daughter and leaving her in a ditch. It made no mention of kings. It was, Tywin thought, a more loyal letter than most of those that spoke that word too often. One night in a chamber that was cooler than the rest, Jaime stood looking at his own face in a small metal-looking glass that had been polished until it lied. He did not see himself as he had used to. He saw a man the city called by a name that might once have been prophecy and now was only armor. Kingsguard. He heard the king whimper in his sleep and think he heard the word burn, and stepped through the doorway like a man who had remembered he had left something on the coals downstairs. He stood over the bed and watched the mouth that had ordered fathers burned to ash and sons hanged by their own throats, watched it move sourly as it dreamed. "You belong to me," Aerys whispered. "You belong to me, all of you. Burn them all." Jaime stood very still and did not take his sword. He did not need to. The jars had been moved. The keys had been taken. The men had been bought who could be bought and replaced who could not. The city would not burn because Tywin Lannister was too stubborn to let any house he lived in do anything he did not command. Jaime let out a breath and felt a strange lightness, as if a stone he had been carrying had learned to balance on his shoulder and now rode there without effort. He could be a good man in a bad tale if the man who wrote it allowed him. He could be a bad man in a good tale if the tale required it. He wanted to be a man who had held one door shut and opened another. There were years after that, years in which the realm had the sort of peace men call dull and women call safety. Men grew fat and then fatter because their wives did not bury children that winter. The king mumbled and sometimes shrieked and sometimes wept, and Cersei put a cup to his lips and brought him meat or withheld it and told him a story she had learned by heart. Viserys grew to think himself a man because he could plant his feet and shout, and then learned the trick of not shouting at all. Aegon learned to ride a pony that disliked him, and then to ride a horse that loved him, and then to command men who neither loved nor hated him but did what he asked because he asked it in a voice that had learned certainty. The princess called Daenerys laughed at everything and cried at almost nothing. She carried the smell of sea salt with her as if it lived in her hair. When at last the old king died, he did so in the afternoon with the light slanting across his face at an unflattering angle. He stopped breathing in the middle of a sentence not worth finishing. He had been telling Cersei a story about a girl he had once known whose eyes had been the color of grapes and whose dress had smelled of mint. Cersei put her hand on his mouth and held it there until the last weak whisper under her palm was gone. And then she lifted her hand and wiped it on a cloth and folded the cloth and placed it in a chest she had made for that purpose years ago. She went out into the hall and nodded to Jaime. and he went in and looked at the dead man as if he might sit up and make a jest. He did not. Jaime reached down and closed the old king's eyes and felt nothing like triumph and nothing like grief. He felt a coolness that pleased him because he recognized it. It was the sensation of a weight removed. He had worn it so long he had forgotten what his shoulders could do without it. They crowned Viserys first because it was proper, and then they crowned Aegon when it became clear to everyone who had eyes that the first crown sat crooked forever and the second one did not. It had been Tywin's plan all along, of course. Or perhaps it was simply what had always been planned by the world. Cersei smiled as the boy she had taught to listen at last spoke a speech that Varys had written and that Tywin had edited, and that sounded as if it had come out of the boy's own mouth anyway. She had become queen by then in every way that mattered. She had learned to watch people walk and to know if they would betray her from the way their heels came down. She had learned to sit very still while men shouted in front of her, and then to say a word that made the room exhale as if the true king had entered. She had learned to make a boy into a man and a man into a tool. She had learned that she could not make one man into anything but what he was. Ned Stark took his boy to the Wintertown and watched him stare at snow with a delight that made him smile and look away, because delight is a dangerous thing when one is trying to seek caution. He trained him with a wooden sword and then with a light steel one and taught him every way he knew to keep a secret. He did not ever write down that secret. He did not ever speak it to a man who was not bound to him by oath or by love. He thought, sometimes, of the city where lions lay on hot stone and men counted sacks of grain more lovingly than they counted the poor. He thought, sometimes, of a girl with white hair who laughed easily and of a boy with a lion's wife and a crown that had been set straight by a father's will. He thought of a realm run by a man who was not king and how safe that might be for a boy who had been born to a crown of ashes. And in the Tower of the Hand, Tywin Lannister sat at his table and died many years later, though not by the means that in another world would have found him. He died old, with his mind still sharp and his list incomplete, which is a fate that angers men like him more than any sword. He died believing he had bent the realm into a shape that would survive him. He died thinking of 3 children who had done as they were told and had not, and of a city that had not burned because he had forbidden it. He died knowing that loyalty is not love and that it is often more useful. He died without remorse, which is a greater kindness than many lords receive. When the bells of the Great September rang to tell the city a hand had fallen from the wrist of the realm, Varys stood at a window and listened. He smiled a little and then did not. He thought of a young man with black hair who had grown harder with each year away from the crown that might have been his in another telling. He thought of a girl whose laughter had sailed across the narrow sea and gathered ships to it without trying. He thought of how stories do not end, of how they are only folded carefully and placed on a shelf until a hand reaches for them again. He thought, as he always did, of knives and blankets and the way men carry one under the other. In the north, where winter made truth visible, a young man stood on the battlements and watched a storm walk across the fields. He had a face that had been taught to hold a secret kindly. He had a sword that had been given with a lie. He had a father who loved him more precisely than he loved himself. He had not yet learned what sort of king a realm might need when the cold walked, or whether he was any such thing. He had learned, though, that men can stand at doors and choose not to let fire in, and that is a kind of royalty that stories do not always name. He stood there, and his breath made a small cloud, and the wind that had traveled from the city to the sea to the mountains found him and wrapped around him like a promise he had yet to keep. They buried the lion at dawn. The bells tolled from the Great September in slow iron strokes, and the sound went out over roofs still damp with night and into courtyards where women swept yesterday's peelings into small neat piles and boys chased one another with broken reeds. It went down into Flea Bottom where the tolling became a complaint among cooking pots, and up the hill to the Red Keep where it came into rooms and made the tapestries seem to lean an inch as if to listen. In the throne room, 100 candles burned with a prim restraint, as if someone had scolded them for showing off. Aegon sat the iron throne as if it were a horse he meant to break gently, one hand light on a spike that did not look murderous until one leaned close. His hair had darkened with the years to a black that shone like oiled iron. His eyes could be blue and kind, or blue and not kind at all. He watched the procession of lords under the ribs of the hall and thought of the first day he had seen his mother alive in that same light, and of the first day he had understood what the realm expected him to be. Princess Elia stood below and to the right, in a gown the color of blood-mixed wine that did not flatter her thinness and deliberately did not. Her grief did not flare. Martell women had learned to keep the desert fire under the skin where it seethed rather than show it to strangers, but it stood at her shoulder like one of her father's spearmen. Beside her, Prince Doran's letter rode in her sleeve, heavy as a stone, and beside that stood Oberyn, who smiled at the floor out of courtesy and at no one out of habit, his hands easy at his sides and ready to make mischief if grief or boredom took him. Princess Cersei came in gold cloth that had not been woven in the city but would be remembered there. She wore no crown, there was none for her, and accepted with exquisite calculation the courtesies due the wife of the Prince of Dragonstone. Viserys came with her, beautiful and uncertain, his hair a spill of pale silk that never stayed where it should no matter how often Pycelle's girls slicked it down with scented oil. He had learned not to blink at the glint of iron. He had learned, with Cersei's help, not to pout when Aegon took the chair at the long table and he the seat below. He had not yet learned how to like it. Kevan Lannister knelt and rose not once but a dozen times that morning as the rituals demanded. He did it well without enjoyment, like a man who eats porridge that is good for him. His beard had gone grayer and his eyes had learned to avoid the corners where Varys might be standing. He had been hand in all but name for 5 months already. Letters written, ships dispatched, conspiracies followed to shabby rooms where boys chewed their nails, and when, at last, Aegon rose and came down the steps with the pin in his hand, Kevan bowed once more and knelt without flourishing. The king set the hand on his breast. It sat there like a verdict calmly reached. When the ceremony had emptied the hall and left only the echo of footsteps and the smell of tallow, Jaime stood looking up at the throne and felt the old itch in his right palm. He had long ago learned to master it. It did not master him. Aegon came back up the carpet, his face thoughtful. They met as two men meet who have stood too many long afternoons with responsibility draped on their shoulders like damp cloaks. "My lord," Aegon said, "your grace, I am told my uncle means to leave for Dragonstone." The king said lightly, and too lightly. "He says the island has been neglected." "It was your grandmother's house," Jaime said. "It is tradition." "Everyone speaks to me of tradition," Aegon murmured. "When I was a boy they gave me a stick and told me to strike the air and call it history. Now they bring me men and tell me to place them as if they were stones in a wall that will outlast winter." He glanced at the throne and away. "He means to take his wife. Princess Cersei will go where her husband goes," Jaime said, "and be down on the quay before dawn to do it. She has had trunks packed for a week." "What is it you fear?" Aegon laughed a short, embarrassed laugh. "It is not fear, but I have learned to watch places where my mother and Princess Cersei stand near the same table." He sobered. "My mother has written to Sunspear that she will come home for a season when the snows in the mountains make pavilions of the almond trees. I would have her go smiling." "She will go with a straight back," Jaime said. "It is the Martell way when there is nothing else left to do." Aegon's eyes softened. "Do you know what she told me? The night before we put the crown on my head, and then, 2 years later, took it off and put it back properly? Tell me." "She said that when a man sits high, he must learn to lower his voice," the young king said. Tywin Lannister spoke low, Ser Jaime. He did not often need to speak twice. "You will learn," Jaime said, and meant it. He had watched Aegon grow into his height and responsibility with a deliberation that sometimes made him impatient and sometimes made him proud in a way he did not examine closely. "You have good advice," the king smiled. "From my hand." "And from your mother," Jaime said. "And from you," Aegon said unexpectedly. Jaime opened his mouth to deflect and closed it again. "Keep Viserys close," he said instead after a moment. "When he sails, give him better ships than he deserves. Give him something to govern that cannot tempt him to think too well of himself. Islands are good for that. And wed yourself before he thinks to beget a son for us to put before you." "Reach or Dorne?" Aegon asked as if discussing wine. It depends how much honey you need, Jaime said drily, and both men thought of Mace Tyrell and of Doran Martell in the same instant with different sensations in their mouths. They made a tourney of the funeral week because the city insisted that grief be accompanied by entertainment when there were coins to be spent and pockets to be picked. On the third afternoon, Oberyn Martell took the sand-colored field with a spear that flashed like a small encouragement to chaos. The crowd loved him instantly. Crowds always do, if they have not yet learned fear. Opposite him rode a young knight from the Reach with a surcoat sewn all over with small flowers like a child's cloak. The boy had a square, clean jaw and a great deal more confidence than teeth. He lasted longer than anyone expected, and then not longer at all. Oberyn knocked him from the saddle, pricked him neatly between joints of plate so he would remember, then bowed with a courtesy that nearly turned to insult and did not. The Reach men hissed because they were supposed to. The Dornish laughed because that is what they did when the Reach hissed. Mace Tyrell clapped plump hands and told anyone who would listen what an excellent lesson it was for the boy, and how he himself had once unhorsed someone important whose name he could not recall because his memory was too crowded with triumphs. In the evening, when the banners hung damp and the air under the stand smelled of horse and crushed clover, Aegon walked the outer circuits with Barristan Selmy 3 steps behind and Jaime 1 step to his left, which complicated etiquette, but there are occasions when etiquette can be compelled to behave. They came upon Oberyn standing by a trestle where someone had left a bowl of cherries. He was pitting them with his thumb and forefinger while a girl from the street watched with eyes like polished coins, imagining the taste. "Your Grace," Oberyn said with a smile that might conceal a sting or might be a sting, "if I had known they built your hand from granite, I would have ridden softer." "My father liked hard men," Aegon said. "He trained me on them." "I always heard he trained you on softer men," Oberyn murmured, and then lifted both hands in apology when Barristan shifted without moving. "Forgive me. Too soon." "Too true," Aegon said without rancor. "Will you return to Sunspear with my aunt, my lord?" "I will and I will not," Oberyn said. "I will see her to the prince's tow. Ar and I will drink wine in my brother's garden and let it be known I am tame. Then I will be gone and the gardens will be relieved to count their daughters in the morning." The coin-eyed girl giggled, and Oberyn tossed her a cherry pit. "Too bitter for you," he told her. "The king prefers dates." "I prefer bread," Aegon said, thinking of hungry winters and of men learning to sleep on empty stomachs. "And quiet borders." "Quiet borders are dull," Oberyn observed. "They are merciful," Aegon said. After the tourney, after the days of small speeches, after the night when Varys Littlebirds overheard 3 men in a dockside tavern toast the dead hand for being a greater king than the king, the court turned to the business of marriage as courts must. Tywin had kept stacks of folded letters in a coffer that smelled of dry leather and cedar. Kevan opened it and found, as he had expected, that they were all answered already, the necessary replies tucked inside and addressed in his brother's hand. The envelopes were blank. Tywin had not considered that his own death might place him in the position of dictating letters he could not sign. Kevan read them and burned 3 and copied 5 and sent 2 that said nothing that could bind and everything that could soothe. Mace sent up word on blue parchment that the flower of the Reach was at the king's feet. The words were painted with care and the messenger wore too much perfume. Aegon read once and set it aside. "My mother prefers Dorne," he said. "Dorne prefers Dorne," Kevan said. "I would prefer it too if I lived there," Aegon said dryly. "But a king does not marry to please one principality alone." He looked at the window where the city had made a thin sheen of smoke that caught morning light and turned it into a web. "My aunt says Arianne writes clever letters." "She does," Elia said from the doorway, and both men turned. She moved like a woman who measured rooms in her head and decided what danger each corner might hold. "She writes clever letters, and she will have sons who read maps before they learn to ride. But the Reach feeds more mouths than Dorne and has more mouths to whisper flattery at feast. If you think to tame Mace by marriage, you will find you have adopted 2 children rather than 1 wife." "He would be flattered to be considered a child," Kevan said. "He would be insulted to be considered the second," Elia said, and a quick flash of Martell humor made her eyes sudden youth for a heartbeat. Aegon, my love, you are king because the realm forgot to die of its wounds. Choose the wife who will keep your wounds closed. Dorne will bleed for you at need with no ring on your finger. The Reach will bleed for you with a ring there and still send you the bill." He laughed at that because her mouth had hooked into almost a smile, the way it had when she first taught him to count his buckles and then his bannermen. "So I wed a Tyrell and keep the Martells with kisses? You wed a Tyrell and place a gold cup in Paxter Redwine's hands and crown his vanity master of ships," Elia said. "You let Randall Tarly pretend he frightens you when his boots thump, so he will stop rattling the tinware in his own hall. And you write to Doran and remind him you are his sister's son, and that you know how to write long letters too. And Arianne? She will laugh and then she will not laugh," Elia said. "And one day she will find herself loving a husband chosen for her by a man she never met, and that will be as she knew it would be when she was 10 and clever and unafraid. Dorne survives by knowing which insults are meant and which are only the price of bread in places where the sun is lazy." Aegon looked at Kevin. Kevin nodded once, and the letters went out like stones dropped in a still pool, ripples spreading in neat circles. When the answer returned from Highgarden, it was tied with green silk and smelled faintly of crushed mint and pride. Mace wrote as if he had invented gratitude and had suffered for it, and offered a daughter whose beauty the house singers had not yet quite learned how to describe because they had so many words and so little breath. Aegon read the letter twice and then asked Barristan what the girl looked like. "Like her grandmother when the wind is behind her," Barristan said gently. "And like Highgarden when the roses are just turned and you have not yet noticed the thorns." "Then we will be careful," Aegon said, and 4 days later he stood in the sept and promised to be careful in words that did not say careful, while Mace beamed and perspired and counted grandchildren in his head. Princess Cersei watched the vows with a mouth that betrayed nothing and a mind that did not know how to stop counting. She stood with Viserys and held his hand in the moment when he would have let his face slide and his nostrils flare. They made a handsome pair, the court said, and meant that they could look at the pair for a long time and not grow bored. Cersei was already with child by then. She had not told Viserys until the day before because she enjoyed surprises when she gave them. Now, as the new queen took the king's hand and the septon watered the stones with holy words, Cersei's palm moved instinctively to her belly and then away again. No one must see a future until the future could be used. On the morning she quickened, she summoned Pycelle and gave him a list of names that Viserys might approve. "Targaryen names," she said, the way a woman says bitter herbs. "Not the dark ones. Jaehaerys, mayhap, or Aemon. Rhaenys," Pycelle said, all treacle and learnedness. "If a girl." "The realm loves old names." "The realm loves gossip," Cersei said. "Let it talk and teach itself the right words." She did not speak aloud the thought that had lodged in her like a splinter. A son would mend the insult of a seat she could not take. A son would put the realm on a path where she could guide his steps. Not now, she had learned later lessons about patience, but in a dozen years, perhaps, when small mistakes grew into larger ones. In the night, after Viserys fell asleep with his hair like a pale cloth over his face, she lay awake and counted the men in the city who would turn when she spoke their names. There were enough. There must always be enough. If there were not, she would make more. Dragonstone received Viserys and Cersei like a grudging host that has remembered the guest has brought a keg. The wind there, even in summer, never quite warmed. The black stone drank their shadows and returned them altered. Cersei laughed on the terrace and let the sea make a mess of her hair, and learned which rooms leaked weeping torrents and which secret doors opened onto stairs that went nowhere. Riella was long dead and had left behind careful ledgers and little else. From a coffer in a damp chamber Cersei took out one of the queen's gowns, plain, heavy, lined with fur, and wore it one morning on a parapet to feel what it had been to live in that skin. She found it did not fit her. She folded it carefully and put it back where it would not be found. Viserys walked every hall and told himself the island had been meant for him since before he was born. He tried to draw the line between pride and resentment and found he could not. In the long room where Aegon the Dragon had once eaten unsmiling meals, Viserys set himself at the head of a long table and discovered he liked the view. Men reduced to rows, servants like small cogs turning. Cersei watched him from the end and drank watered wine. She learned the steps in his vanity's dance and counted the beats between his small triumphs and his sudden collapses. If he had been born first, she thought, the Iron Throne would still have needed a man behind it. She was content to be that figure for the island. For now, a raven came from Pike in the 9th month of Aegon's marriage. It had lost 3 feathers and 1 eye. Balon Greyjoy's hand had written it in black strokes that went through the parchment like nails. It declared the Iron Islands free and salt-crowned and contemptuous. He called himself king and called the rest of the realm sheep. He spoke of nets and axes and the old way that ate sons and salted the women's eyes. He sent, after the raven, 100 longships into the sunset sea to take what they could learn to hate. He sent 20 into the Mander with the early frost and a confidence that smelled of rot. The small council met at once. Paxter Redwine arrived sooner than he could have had he not been waiting all along in the chamber outside, and drew his finger across a map of the Mander with the intimacy of a man who had swum that river as a boy and learned to kiss in the reeds. "I can have 50 war galleys in the mouth of the Mander in 10 days, he said. 47 if you want them to sink when a bucket's kicked. They will not pass the arbor. They will pass the arbor and they will be welcome to fires," Randyll Tarly said flatly. "But they will leave bodies. I want raiding parties hung from my trees, not drinking in my halls." "You will have both," Kevin said. "The Iron Men are never clever and always lucky. That is why they are dangerous. We will take the luck out of their hands." He turned to Aegon. "Your Grace, we will need 2 strokes. 1 to clear the Mander and the Shield Islands. 1 to break Pike." "Stannis," Aegon said at once. "And Lord Robert." Barristan bowed his head slightly, as if to say an old tale was being told again, and it never lost its savor. Ravens flew that evening with orders in a hand that had learned to write command lightly but not to hide it. Stannis answered with a boatman's economy of words. Ships, men, tide, moon. Robert did not answer with a letter. He came himself, hammer on his saddle, his laugh at the gate as rough as it had ever been. He went to his knees before the throne because he remembered, at the last, the price of bread, and Aegon lifted him with both hands and called him Lord and kinsman and meant one more than the other. "Pike," Robert said cheerfully in the council, and put a knuckle to Victarion Greyjoy's place on the map. "I have not heard a hall scream in too long." "You will let Lord Stannis play Admiral," Aegon said, "and you will play Thunder. You will bring me Balon alive if you can. The realm deserves to hate him. If you cannot bring him alive, bring me his crown. If you cannot bring me his crown, bring me his sons." Robert glanced sideways. "And after, if I have a mind to fish nearer home? You will feast with me and then go home," Aegon said without any ceremony at all. Robert grinned as if the king had made a jest. The war in the west smelled of tar and apples. In the Mander, Redwine galleys cut longship keels with practiced contempt and then learned respect when a shoal shifted and 3 sleek green hulls took the sand and lay there like fish waiting for knives. Randyll Tarly rode his boarders and hung men without speeches. In the Shield Islands, a woman with red hair put an arrow through an Iron Man captain's throat at 100 paces, and her husband kissed her hard afterward and named a field for her. These stories moved like mice beneath the larger tale and had their own teeth. Stannis drove his fleet with a grim patience that refused triumph until the last sail fell. On a gray morning, the arbor wine tasted of salt. He ran 3 lines of Drommons across the bay below Pike and let them take the ramshackle fire that came tumbling off the cliffs. His sails smoldered and flared. Men cried out and beat the flames with wet sailcloth while Stannis' face did not change. Behind the first line slid a second with hides draped over their planking like ugly veils. Behind that a third that had no business being there at all, low craft from the Mander, barges driven by men with hands older than the silver in their hair. Stannis had asked for them because a river knows how to put itself where no one expects a ship to go, and a river runs flat under fire when a sea grows petulant and leaps. The barges slunk under the cliff to a small pebbled spit where 3 goats watched them disembark with interest. At the same breath, Robert stormed the main bridge at Pike with 200 Stormlanders and a grin that ate iron. The bridges swung. Men tumbled. Hammers fell. Axes bit. The sea hissed. The old stones remembered their first builders and begrudged these new men their fun. Robert found Roderick Greyjoy at the second bridge and took his face in with a glance. A jaw too proud and a mind already dead because it did not leave room for surrender. The hammer took Roderick at the hip and robbed him of motion and gave him gallantry to die with. Meryn fell with a stunned look that said he had meant to kill a dozen men that day and had been cheated. Balon fought in the smoky hall of the Seastone Chair and bled on Black Rock and laughed until the laugh broke. When it ended, Stannis had a crown made of rough iron that smelled of old salt and older grief. Robert held it up like a child wearing a wolf's pelt and howled once, because it pleased the men to hear it. Then he went quiet while Aegon's banner went up on pike for the first time in a man's lifetime. They brought Balon to King's Landing in chains that embarrassed the court and feed fleas. He walked into the throne room and spat a tooth on the floor and did not kneel. "Hang me," he said. "I have earned it." "You have," Aegon agreed gently, "but I will not. I have sons enough hung already by other men." He stood from the throne and stepped down until they were level. "You will give me your youngest, Theon. He will learn names here. You will go home and never leave your islands again. If you leave, I will hang 2 men for 1 footstep, and the second will be someone you like so that it will hurt." Balon smiled with his broken mouth. "You are your father's son after all," he said, and the words made 3 old lords in the hall draw breath at once as if they had heard a prophecy answered. "A better father than you," Aegon said. "I know what to do with sons." He turned his head. "Ser Barristan, see to the boy. He will be sent north to Lord Stark. Give the man a house that won't leak." Balon barked laughter that had no amusement at all. "Stark," he said. "Let it be wolves then, salt or snow. Either way he'll die with his mouth full of something that hates iron." He bowed like a man falling and walked out trailing the smell of his misfortunes. When Theon came to Winterfell, the yard was white around the edges where the night had been mean. Robb Stark watched the Ironborn dismount with the curiosity of boys who have not yet learned to be cruel. Jon stood beside him, dark and quiet, and saw the swagger before Theon himself had decided to wear it. Maester Luwin met them with bread and salt because Ned Stark was exact in such things. The boy tried to laugh at the hospitality and found the laugh poorly received. He learned, very slowly, that there were houses where laughter must be earned. He learned, even more slowly, that the kindness that accompanied discipline could break a man harder than cruelty if the man tried to resist it. A letter arrived at Winterfell not long after with the small careful hand that had always made Ned swallow something he could not have named. Aemon, the maester at the wall, wrote without flourish and with a warmth that had nothing to do with summer. He told of a ranger who had not come back, of tracks in snow that did not look like any man's, of stories that repeated themselves among the wildlings with the slow seriousness of old tales that mean to become new history. He excused himself for troubling Lord Stark with old men's talk. He did not excuse himself for being afraid. Ned read the letter twice and placed it in a box and said nothing that evening at table. But in the morning he sent men to the wall with grain and leather and a young smith and a quiet boy who knew how to fetch and carry and keep a mouth shut. When word came to King's Landing that the Night's Watch had lost 2 ranges in one winter and had grown quiet on the subject in spring, Aegon listened. Kevan tilted his head, the way he did when he heard a hinge creak in a house he had not built. The Reach thought of wolves and turned back to their vines. Dorne heard ice and shivered and pulled the sun blanket up. Cersei heard nothing and counted gates and guard captains instead. She held her son on her lap beneath a window with dirty glass and told him that he would have anything he wanted if he first learned which words other men wanted. Viserys looked on with a love that was ill-suited to him and yet the best he had. They named the boy Jaehaerys as Cersei had suggested. Viserys said the word as if it had been his offering, and she let him keep it. The child had a coil of pale hair like a bubble of spun sugar and eyes that could be green in one candle and purple in another, and then go to some clear color that had no name and belonged only to him. Jaime held him once, in a corridor when Cersei met Elia and the 2 women's courtesies slid past one another like sharp blades under silk. He did not look at his sister's face while he did it. The child's hand closed around his thumb with the ferocity that infants mistake for intent, and Jaime suddenly imagined a future he would not be allowed to see. The hand was still on his thumb, and the boy was taller than he and scowled at him from a chair shaped like a sword. He gave the child back before the vision could smell fear on him. "Your niece is beautiful," he said to Elia afterward, because the words amused him. "She is," Elia said gravely. "All babies are beautiful if they belong to someone else." Marjorie Tyrell learned the city the way a cat learns a house, by smelling each doorway and choosing which to mark. She smiled where she should and remembered names no one else remembered, and began to invite women to afternoon treats on a terrace that always seemed to catch the breeze. She asked Elia to bring the prince, and Elia did. The two women sat together with the ease of people who have chosen not to draw knives. Aegon played Cyvasse with Lord Redwine and learned to lose with grace and to win without smirking. Kevin watched the board while pretending not to and saw the king begin to understand how to be obvious in order to conceal subtlety. Varys watched everything and wrote little. The alchemists complained that no one asked them to make lovely jars anymore. Rossart walked past the Guildhall vaults 3 times a week like a man circling a grave and not remembering whose name had been carved on the stone. In the 4th year of Aegon's reign, as men count such things, the North sent up a story wrapped in a cold that made Summer step back and think. Benjen Stark rode to the wall and did not send letters back as often as he had promised. The king's messenger returned with news of 5 wildlings taken with blue lips and knives of stone. Maester Aemon's hand shook on the parchment for the first time. The letter carried, beneath the words, the smell of cold iron and fear. Barristan brought it to Aegon and stood a little closer to the throne than he had on other days. "Send men," Barristan said. "I have men," Aegon said. "I will send them. But more than that, I will send bread and wool and what passes for hope among walls that look both ways. And I will remind them that the crown remembers they are of the realm and not the far end of a map. And if the others walk," Barristan said, so softly that the words seemed to shiver, "then we will discover what use the south is to the north," Aegon said. "It would be a fine thing to know before I die." He wrote to Ned Stark himself that night, and the letter said little more than a man can say when he wishes to be one man speaking to a knot. Her and not a king making a statement with a seal. It asked for news. It offered aid. It admitted ignorance. Promised listening. Ned read it and smiled slightly and called for a fresh sheet and a clear pen and wrote back in the same kind. "It is easy to like a king," he wrote later to Catelyn when he remembers he is a man. "It is harder to trust the men who must surround him to keep him a king. But this one has learned to keep clever men on short chains and to give them meat often. That is either wisdom or luck. Time will tell me which, and perhaps it will not matter." In Dragonstone's long room, where smoke curled up to rafters carved to look like dragons that could not breathe, Cersei took maps down from pegs and spread them long. Viserys ran his finger along the eastern coast like a man tempted by a mistress he has not yet paid for. Essosi merchants bent their backs like reeds and poured out lists of ports that would welcome a prince with a name and a purse. "It will be my progress," Viserys said. "I will sit on a balcony and let men come and talk to me of wines I pretend to understand. I will show them Targaryen hair and teach them what glimmers before gold." "You will take our son," Cersei said, not a question. Viserys hesitated. "He is small." "He will learn ships," Cersei said. "You will not drown him. I will see to it." The sea lay out beyond the narrow windows, gray and convinced. She had come to love its certainty. It always answered the same way, and there was comfort in that. "You will go to Bravos first. They hate crowns there. Show them a pleasant circlet that does not pinch. Smile at their sea lord as if you believed he were prettier than you." Viserys laughed, warmed by the idea of foreign eyes turned toward him. "The boy will be seasick. He will cry." "I cried," Cersei said. "No one noticed." She did not say that the sea had taught her a lesson the court had not. The tide's patience always wins, not the wave's fury. She folded a map and hid a thought behind it. A son whose first word would be no or mine must learn to say yes to her if not to others. A voyage might teach him that. If it did not, she would teach it herself. Oberyn came to the capital again in summer with a girl by one hand and a boy by the other, both with eyes that seemed to assess rather than look. He kissed Elia on both cheeks and told Aegon he had come to see if there were still women in King's Landing who remembered how to be grateful in ways that books do not record. He took the measure of Margaery and found her as clever as everyone said and less patient than she pretended. He found Jaime in the yard and had him show 3 squires how to catch a low cut with the strong of the blade rather than the weak. "You are better than your stories," Oberyn told him afterward. "I have bad stories," Jaime said. "You have an old one," Oberyn said. "Old stories become bad when men get tired of them. Find a new one. You have the bones for it." He tilted his head. "Do you remember Rhaegar?" "I killed for him," Jaime said, and a muscle jumped once beside his jaw. "We all killed for something," Oberyn said. "You still do." Aegon and Margaery took to riding in the mornings along the river, rode out toward the far fields where the smell of the city thinned and the smell of turned earth took over. They talked without courtiers at their backs, which is not to say no one listened. The willows had ears, and so did 2 boys who had learned to run with no sound on the path. They talked of small things on purpose and of large things reluctantly. Margaery understood that the way to shape a man was with patience and small acts. She had learned it at her grandmother's knee and would never forget. Aegon understood that a king cannot be loved by all and should not spend his time learning to be. He learned to say we and mean I, and to say I and mean the realm. That autumn a fire took 4 houses near the Street of Silk and ate 3 women and a boy and a roomful of old clothes. The alchemists came to the council and complained that if they had been permitted to tend to the city's narrow places, such accidents could be prevented. Kevin told them that jars do not put out fires well even when filled with water, and they retreated with wounded dignity. A week later, 5 gold cloaks were found to have taken coin from brothel keepers. Janos Slynt apologized with the ease of men who expect to be forgiven for crimes they do not trouble to conceal. Aegon replaced 2, moved a 3rd to knights, gave Slynt a purse and a warning, and watched to see who treated it as an insult and who as a reprieve. In 3 months, a baker's daughter was not taken from a lightless alley because the man who would have taken her had learned that the wrong corners were suddenly watched. "Your father would have hanged them all," Margaery said that night, hair let down on the terrace, her feet bare to the stone. "My father was good at making men fear rope," Aegon said. "I am learning to make them fear disappointment." She looked at him and then away. "Fathers always want their sons to be improved versions of themselves," she said. "Mothers want them to be safe." "What do wives want?" Aegon asked. "Rooms with windows that open on more than one view," she said. A raven brought word to the rock that Cersei was in childbed again, and that the seas had been mild the last 3 months, and that the boy Jaehaerys had thrown a cup at a ship's cat and learned that some creatures forgive slower than others. Jaime read the letter in his father's old solar amid books that smelled of dust and conquest. He held the parchment a long time. Then he went to the yard and drilled until his arms sang. In the Night Fort courtyard, a crust of dirty snow held tracks where no man had walked. A ranger named Malador slid his glove off and put his naked hand to the print and pulled it back fast because the cold there was meaner than the air's. "I don't like it," he said, and his companion spat and said nothing because the spit froze before it hit the ground, and that felt like an omen to him. Ravens croaked and would not come to the hand. In a tower stair, a thing scuttled. Old men slept badly for no good reason they could name and woke with the taste of iron in their mouths. Maester Aemon wrote again. "It is a wise king who listens to men who cannot help him," he wrote in his slow, neat hand. "If your grace will forgive an old man a boldness, I think it wise to begin sending more boys north who know that cold is not merely air but a knife, and that walls are not merely stone but oaths. The night's watch is not a song sung at summer feasts. It is a poor, stubborn verse men hum when they do not wish to be frightened. Forgive me for speaking as if I were your grandfather. Some liberties must be taken in winter." Aegon read the letter twice and then told Kevin to speak to the city's judges. They would offer thieves a choice more often: hand, brand, or the wall. They would choose the wall more often, once the judges learned to speak of it properly and the men in black learned to parade properly, and to look poor and stubborn in ways that made boys think of songs they did not know yet but might hum later. He wrote also to lords with too many sons. Send us second sons who need to be taught how to sleep with a clear conscience. Some did. Some sent the third sons instead. Some sent no sons at all and told themselves stories about harvests that would be better next year. Cersei delivered a girl at Dragonstone under a sky that decided to rain at the last moment and then changed its mind. They named her Rhaenys because Elia had not complained the first time and because Viserys liked to speak her name as if he too were a dragon. The girl had a cry like a torn ribbon and a smile like sunlight finding a crack in shutters. Jaehaerys poked her once with a serious forefinger and then became fiercely protective of the privilege. When they sailed for Volantis in spring, Cersei watched the children sleep in a shared cradle and felt something that was not love and not pride but a certain cold calculation soften momentarily. Viserys stood at the stern with his hair afloat in the breeze and cursed a sailor for knotting a rope badly. Cersei smiled at him until the sailor went away and then told him in the tone she used on children that ropes were like courtiers. If they were knotted wrong, you did not shout at them, you cut them and tied them properly. Volantis received them with lanterns that turned the river into a patient serpent, and with girls who painted their feet, and with merchants who had learned to smile with their eyes and keep their mouths for bargaining. Viserys played at prince and then believed it. Cersei gathered information the way other women gathered jewelry. She learned which captains the Sea Lord of Bravo spite bought when their boats were empty, which Pentoshi owed coin to which magister whose daughters liked to play with small golden lions. She sent 2 letters to King's Landing to be sent on to Old Town by quiet hands, and in return received 3 fat books bound in calfskin describing the trade of spice and men and false histories. She read them and did not believe them and wrote notes in the margins like a man marking where to cut on a coat that had been stitched badly. In King's Landing, Peter Baelish at last came to court by way of a woman's letter that was both love and trap. Lisa Arryn had begged for a place for her clever childhood sweetheart, and the hand had relented in the way men do when a request costs little and might turn a profit. Kevin looked at the boy. He would always be a boy to a Lannister, and saw quick eyes and nimble words and hands that would lift a purse without blushing. He set him to master of coin and waited to see whether he would steal from the table or clean it. Peter smiled a great deal and gave people what they thought they wanted and began 5 businesses in places that sold none of the wares they advertised. He visited Marjorie and taught her a card game that always seemed to leave someone owing the wrong person, and Marjorie learned it and smiled and won and never played it again. Varys and Baelish circled one another as cats do when both are fat and both have claws. They spoke on terraces when no one else could appear to be near. They smiled in council and let the king think that smiles meant something. Varys continued to bring tidings out of dark corners and Baelish began to make corners where tidings might be born. "Do you trust him?" Aegon asked Kevin, meaning Peter. "I trust him to be hungry," Kevin said. "Hunger can be useful, keeps a man moving." "And Varys, I trust him to be frightened," Kevin said. "Frightened men do not often make foolish bets." "What are you?" Aegon asked. "Bored," Kevin said, and the king laughed. Years folded over the city the way a cloak is folded over a sleeping body, without malice. Sansa Stark was born beneath a northern roof built for patience. Arya Stark came like a small storm over snow and began to run before the wet was out of her hair. Far south, a boy named Tommen was born to a queen who had waited for a prince. He was soft and smelled of milk and success. Jaehaerys grew into himself as a blade grows into a scabbard, with an intent that is not the scabbard's. He learned to like the deck under him and to walk with sailors' knees and to call old men sir, in a way that made them smile. Rhaenys learned to pull hair and then to laugh when scolded and then to steal small things and hide them where no one could find them and then bring them back in tears because her mother had looked at her too quietly. Aegon went to Old Town at last to hear the High Septon mumble something that meant nothing and to walk with Lord Leighton's daughter on 3 rooflines where the wind tried to lift him and he learned to lean. Marjorie looked at the high tower and thought of how long it had stood and of what kind of mortar holds when men die and new men invent new words for old duties. Elia stood in a high room with her hands on the stone and remembered that she had once been a girl and not a parable. She wrote to Doran that the king was learning, and Doran wrote back that he was glad and that his joints hurt in winter in a way that made the day seem longer. Then, one winter noon that decided to be evening earlier than it should have, 3 men came down from the wall with a tail that refused to be a tail. They spoke of a thing in the wood that moved without making snow scream, of eyes like the blue along a sword's edge, of a body that did not stay dead. They laid a cloth on the council table and pulled it back like a conjurer, and on the table lay a hand that had not been attached to anything for more days than a hand ought to remain a hand. It did not smell as a hand ought to smell after such time. It did not behave as a hand ought. The fingers were black and the nails wrong, and when Barristan touched it with a blade it twitched as if irritated. The room held its breath. Mace Tyrell had the good sense to say nothing. Baelish tilted his head and smiled as if the trick were crude. Varys' eyes went to Aegon's. Kevin looked at the hand and saw for the first time in many months the blank place in any list where the line that reads war might be written again, and not with ink this time. "You have my attention," Aegon said to the men, because a king must not say, "I am afraid." He had learned the difference. "You shall have my support." He looked at the hand. "Send the watch what they need. We will raise men to garrison Queen's Crown and Long Barrow for the winter. Lord Stark will advise us where best to put strength." "And the faith?" Marjorie asked later, in the terrace's pale dusk. "They will make a sermon of this. They will make a collection plate of it," Aegon said, and then smiled to make the words gentler. "Let them. If men give bread to fear, the bread does not go to waste." That night Aemon sent another letter, thanked the king and told him a story. Once there were dragons, he wrote, because old men like to speak of dragons. Once there were men who believed fire could stand alone against cold and do all the work. They learned that fire is lazy without men's hands to move it. "Forgive me again for being what I am. I was born to a life that I did not live and have lived a life that I would not have chosen. Yet I am content to say a thing plainly at last. Send us men who believe in walls. Send us boys who will become men and not mind that no one will sing of them." Aegon slept badly. He dreamed of a river that burned and of hands that twitched on tables. He dreamed of his father's rubies sinking and of his mother's thin hand on his hair and of Tywin's voice speaking from a place where voices are not supposed to come. He woke with the taste of ash and snow both in his mouth and went, before the sun, to the yard and moved until sweat washed it out. There are seasons when the realm forgets it will die. There are seasons when it remembers too often. The years that followed taught men to hold both thoughts in the head. The king grew into the habit of being king without making it his whole self. The queen learned to turn the city's moods as a woman turns a looking glass. The hand counted and balanced and prayed, in his own Lannister way, that no catastrophe would exhaust his sums. Princess Alia's health wavered and then returned and then wavered again. Still she moved with that upright grace that made young women imitate her in the street and boys look away and imagine. On Dragonstone, Cersei wrote to her father's empty chair and did not receive an answer. She taught Jaehaerys to read letters in 2 scripts so that he did not grow up contemptuous of men who wrote differently. She taught Rhaenys to listen at doors without being seen and then cuffed her when she was caught, because discipline makes better skills. She loved Viserys as much as she was able and wanted more from him than any man alive could have given her. It was not his fault. She made herself a promise that no one would ever hear. Promises said aloud belong to other people. Promises kept in the mouth belong to the women who made them. One morning as she looked east out across a sea that had learned, in its old age, to be playful, a ship came up over the line of water with a painted prow like a bird that had swallowed gold. It flew no crown's flag. The men who came ashore had a step that did not belong to the free cities and spoke in a tongue that had been salted by many coasts. One of them brought gifts for the Prince of Dragonstone, curios and clever trivialities, and, wrapped at the bottom of a case in unmarked linen, a small dragon's egg that was pretty and useless. Cersei took the egg in both hands and felt the dead heat men always say lives in such stones. It was striped green and black like a thing that had once breathed the water instead of air. Viserys laughed and lifted it and called for wine and declared that it would sit on his table, so those who came to speak to him would remember whose house it had been. Cersei smiled and thought of fire, and of what men do when they are given symbols they do not deserve. When word reached Aegon that his uncle had put a dragon's egg on a table at Dragonstone and called it decoration, he smiled and wrote a letter that spoke of children's toys, and of how kindly the king regarded his dear brother's amusements. He did not write down the thought that went under the words. Symbols are a rope that can be used to pull men across a pit. He sent Marjorie a sprig of winter heather from the pot in his chamber and walked down to the smithy and watched a sword be made from nothing into something, from dull iron into a line of light that taught him once more how hard it is to refine a world. In Winterfell's Godswood, where the heart tree had a face that did not pity and did not disdain, Ned Stark knelt and said names that he was always careful to say in the same order. Jon stood toward the edge and watched the water pool and the way leaves fell into it and made small circles that touched and became a larger circle and then went still. The boy was nearly a man and had decided to stay so long he sometimes forgot that he had not been born to it. Robb came with a grin and a tale of a slow horse, and Arya with a desk knife, and Theon with a pair of boots that made him look like something he was not and was. They laughed and then did not. The winter wind pushed through the branches. Somewhere in a hall nearby, Catelyn passed a hand over a cradle with tenderness that would break a lesser woman and did not break her. She had learned how to be less than tender with herself. That was how houses are kept. Beyond the wall, in a place a ranger could not have found by walking straight or left or right, a thing that had once been a man looked down at its hand and flexed its fingers and did not remember why the movement should matter. It looked up. The sky had learned a new color. The wind had learned a new voice, turned its head as if called. If it had ever believed in kings, it did not now. "Send me men who believe in walls," Aemon had written. The realm began, slowly, to remember how to build them. In King's Landing they made lists. In Lannisport they hammered rims onto wagon wheels. In White Harbor they salted pork and set aside the best cuts for the watch. In Sunspear they rolled their eyes at northern gloom and sent spears anyway because Elia asked it. In Highgarden Mace wrote a speech no one would ask him to give and told his grandson it was important for men to learn several faces of bravery. In Pike, Balon counted the days between small transgressions and argued with his own shadow. In Bravos, men who had once laughed at crowns began to listen to talk of winter with a seriousness that surprised their wives. And on a high morning when the sun came in hard from the sea and set the very mortar glittering, Aegon stood in the gallery above the yard and watched two boys fight. One was Lannister, a cousin of Kevin's, light on his feet and too in love with his blade. One wore no great name, a burly gull from the river who had learned to fight not to fall and got up when he fell. The Lannister boy danced. The gull learned. The Lannister boy looked up, saw the king, and tried to impress him. The gull boy forgot there were eyes at all and wrapped the hilt in his palm as if it were all he had left in the world that would not break if he squeezed. The bout ended as it should have. Aegon clapped once. "Your Grace," Barristan asked quietly. He had learned to hear a king's thoughts before they turned into words. "We will need both sorts," Aegon said. "Men who can dance and men who remember to stand." He thought of the river once more, and of green fire that had refused to drown, and of a boy who had laughed at bread and then learned to bake it. He thought of a promise made in a tower of white stone, and of a letter written by a very old man who had once been very young and had given up on being king so that a wall could have another voice. He thought of his uncle on an island he loved because it made him feel large, of a sister who laughed because she had not yet been asked to give anything away, of a wife who planted gardens in courtyards no one had thought would take root and watched to see who came to walk there when they thought no one was looking. He thought, and then he stopped thinking and went to hear petitions because there were always men asking for what they could not give themselves. A king's work is never done, and if it is done well, no one notices. The first petitioner that day was a little man in a brown cap who carried, wrapped in sackcloth, a hand. Not the sort they had seen before, no. This one was warm and smelled human and had been taken from a corpse near the Mander by a farmer who had the poor luck of being curious. A broken ring clung to the smallest finger, a cheap thing that had belonged to someone who had loved someone once. The hand was not what mattered. What mattered was the story that came behind it, from men who had seen men move in ways that made the air look wrong. Aegon touched the sackcloth with 2 fingers, then folded the cloth over again and put his hand atop it as if to make a seal. "We will not be frightened into stupidity," he said, as much to himself as to those gathered. "We will not be proud into carelessness. We will be what we should be." "And what is that?" Baelish asked lightly from the side, as if he had not already written half a dozen letters that morning that would yield coin in 3 different cities. A realm, Aegon said, that knows how to hold a door. He dismissed the petitioner with coin and with thanks that were not merely words. Later, in the quiet between the day's last matter and the bell for supper, he went up to the top of Maegrs and looked out toward the north as if he could see beyond its horizon. The air had that particular clarity late autumn gives before the fog returns and men pretend again that the world is smaller than it is. Marjorie came to stand beside him. They did not speak for a while. "What are you thinking?" she asked at last. "That you can build a city the way you build a fire," he said. "You need little sticks as well as large logs. You need wind and you need a hand. You need patience. And you need to send someone to fetch more wood before it is gone. And if it rains, then you remember where the dry places are kept," he said and smiled. And when he smiled, for a moment he looked like the line of men for whom the realm had nearly died and then had not. In the rock, a servant found a place behind a chest where a paper had fallen when Tywin was alive and remained after he was not. He did not read because he could not, but he brought it to Jaime as if bringing a bird's egg, careful with his hands. Jaime unfolded it and saw his father's neat measured hand and a list of names that did not surprise him and 2 that did. One was his own. One was a boy's name from the north that had never been spoken in the rock and would not be spoken now. He burned the paper and went down to the yard and drilled until the shadows were all in different places. And at Dragonstone, in the room that had once held a queen's small treasures, Cersei opened the coffer she alone knew and took out, for no reason she would have admitted, a lock of a dead child's hair tied with a thread. She looked at it and closed her eyes and saw, for one impossible heartbeat, the city far away smoke-free and safe, and her son on a chair not made of swords. She did not believe in prophecy, or rather, she believed in only one kind, the kind a woman makes when she can see a thing clearly and means to have it. She put the hair away and shut the coffer and rang for a maid to bring a cup of wine. The sea outside made its old patient sound, as if counting. On the wall a horn sounded once, then again, then not yet a 3rd time. Men turned their heads and held their breath, and the breath misted and rose and vanished. Maester Aemon put a hand on a boy's arm and said softly, "Wait." He had learned to make one word do the work of many. And at Winterfell, Jon stood beside the heart tree and closed his eyes and listened and did not know what he listened to until later, when he would remember that the air had tasted like iron and like promise and like the moment before a door opens or does not. He opened his eyes and saw his father walking toward him across the snow with the sort of expression that means a man has news he does not yet know how to say. Jon straightened and for no reason thought of kings and of walls and of both together. He smiled at his father and then did not, because Ned Stark's eyes told him to be a man before the words did. "Come," Ned said simply. "We have letters, and a choice that does not look like a choice. So it goes when the realm lifts its head and sees winter at the far edge of a field and decides, with a very old courage, to finish the harvest and set stones in a better line and teach its children how to bank fires. Men will say the lions did this and the stags did that, and the rose preened and the sun burned and the trout swam where it wanted and the kraken sulked. They will sing of kings, because songs require them, and of queens, because life requires them. But the truth of it is smaller and more stubborn. The realm endured because doors were held and maps were read and boys were sent into cold with wool and bread and words that taught them what to do when horns blew twice and dread asked for a 3rd. In King's Landing, as the evening bells tolled and the smoke sheets took on the color of wine, Aegon stood by a window and breathed, slowly, as if measuring his chest against the air. Marjorie came and took his hand without looking at him. It was a habit they had learned. Far away, the sea made its promises and then kept those it meant to keep. On an island, a woman in gold made a vow to herself that would be a problem one day. In a cold wood, a boy put his hand to a tree older than memory and did not know that he had already been asked to give more than one life can contain. And beneath all of it, like a quiet river under ice, old stories moved, unhurried and sure, waiting for the moment when men would need them to turn into truths again.